And we're back. Welcome, everybody. Today we're looking at our first lesson for Chapter 15, Section 1, The Reforming Spirit. And our essential question for today, what movements sprang up between 1820 and 1860 to try and improve conditions within the United States? Now, Chapter 15, if it can be summed up in one phrase, it's what now? Well, things were going pretty well in the United States. We remember the era of good feeling where everybody was pretty pro-US, and we looked at westward expansion and manifest destiny, and everyone's pretty excited about the direction the country is moving. Well, some people started looking at life within the United States and thinking, I feel like something should be better. I feel like we might be able to change some things. So that's what we're going to be looking at in Chapter 15, kind of taking an inward look at the United States between about 1820 and 1860, and ideas and things that came to the forefront of people trying to improve conditions in the United States. And as you can see, we've already done an audio recording for today's lesson, and the picture is of Yoda, because why wouldn't it be? So if you want to use the audio recordings, you're more than welcome. Or if you want to just read through, you're also more than welcome. But if not, let's continue on and take a look at our key terms. And our key terms for today are social reform, predestination, the Second Great Awakening, revival, debtor, and the temperance movement. So let's get into things. Reform. Reform, reform, reform. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. Healthcare reform, education reform, immigration reform, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And it seems like everything in our society has some sort of reform attached to it. Actually, our wonderful school, Pennsylvania Leadership Charter School, is in existence because of a push to reform education and make it more personalized for each student. But at its most basic, the word reform simply means to change, and it implies that this change will be an improvement on an existing idea. Public schools existed long before PALCS was even somebody's idea, but new legislation allowed for our school to be created as another public school option in Pennsylvania. And personally, I'm very happy about that because it gives me the opportunity to teach all of you and to hang out with Mr. Rigner. So over the next few lessons, we will look at the growth of various reform movements in the United States in the early to mid 1800s. And these movements were aimed to try and improve various parts of society: prisons, hospitals, women's rights, slavery, education, so on and so on and so on. And they grew out of political, social, and religious roots. And what we're looking at right now actually is the symbol of the Reform Party, which was founded in 1996 by H. Ross Perot, because he felt that Americans were, quote, disillusioned with the state of politics and desired alternatives to the Democratic or Republican parties. So just like Ross Perot formed a whole political party based on giving alternatives, we're going to look at some of the alternatives to the current state of hospitals and women's rights that existed in the early 1800s. But first, let's get some background on where these ideas of these reform movements, from where they came. Now, the movement for social reform in the mid-1800s grew out of political and religious roots. And social reform is it's a concerted effort to try and improve upon existing legislation or just things in society. So let's first look at the political roots. We saw a little bit of this when we talked about the Jacksonian era. And if you remember, during that time, we saw that politics were becoming much more democratic, and because more people were able to become involved. Voting rights were extended to much larger sections of the population. But critics stated that even though things were in the works, it still was not democratic enough. The liberty and equality that was promised under the Declaration of Independence was still limited to a very small segment of society, basically white men over 21. So critics stated that a true democracy would not allow slavery or limit the rights of women. So politically, it's these growth of democratic ideals which people are looking at and seeing as should be applied to larger and larger segments of society. Now, the religious roots came from different religious movements of this era, and they really influenced the need for social reform. The biggest one of this from this time period is the Second Great Awakening, and it was a movement among Protestants that taught that people could choose to save their souls, and that people had free will when it came to choosing salvation from God. And this was huge because it went against the traditionally held belief of predestination, and predestination stated that God chose certain people for salvation and that there was nothing that a person could do to change that. Well, how did this impact society? Prior to the Second Great Awakening, people kind of lived in this fear that God was going to reject them no matter what they did. But with this new emphasis on free will, it led some to teach that salvation was the first step to changing society, and thus changing the world. Preachers would travel around to different areas and hold revivals, which are these large outdoor meetings to try and stir up people's religious feelings. So politically, the democracy and the growth of democratic ideals that we see coming out of the Jacksonian era, people are wanting to politically have that go to more segments of the population. And then religiously, if people could choose to save their own souls, then in doing so, that was the first step to changing society and thus changing the world. So just to sum it all up, the reform movements of this time had political origins with the ideas of liberty and equality of the Declaration of Independence, inspiring people to try and improve society. During the Jacksonian era, more people could vote than ever before, and critics said that slavery and other injustices violated democratic ideals. While religiously, we mentioned the Second Great Awakening stressing free will over predestination, and these revivals, these large outdoor meetings, encouraged people to try and reform their own lives, and that individual salvation is the first step to reforming a society. And our first video is going to go over some of the ins and outs of the Second Great Awakening, and we will watch that and then pick up with some of the reform movements that were popping up at this time.
By the 1790s, only a small portion of white Americans belonged to a traditional church. The new theologies that are emerging reflect modern scientific attitudes and de-emphasize the role of God in the world. But beginning in 1801, traditional religion stages a dramatic comeback.
The Second Great Awakening starts in Kentucky and Tennessee with a series of quite spectacular emotional frontier revivals. The fellow who is to the Second Great Awakening what George Whitefield was to the first is a former lawyer turned Presbyterian minister by the name of Charles Finney. It is Finney who is the great impresario of revivalism. In fact, he even writes a book on the subject about how, quite specifically, you go into a town and do your advance work and then proceed to conduct your revival. So Finney is a fascinating character, a rationalist and an empiricist in a sense, who really believes that you can do certain things quite scientifically to create an upswelling of religious enthusiasm.
What is also new about the Second Great Awakening is its link to social reform.
And so there are a whole bevy of organizations that come out of the first half of the 19th century for distributing Bibles, distributing tracts, organizations that get together and collect money for missionaries, both at home and abroad. And then, of course, temperance organizations, organizations to redeem prostitutes, anti-slavery organizations. And so the distinctive feature of popular religious expression in the Second Great Awakening is that people move from revivals to these various forms of social activism, which are quite deliberately engineered by the astute clergymen who thought them up, both to do good and to prolong the intensity of popular religious commitment.
So let's look at some of these reform movements. Now, one of the first areas to be looked at for reform was the prison system, and alongside of that was the hospital system. And it started with a school teacher from Boston. In 1841, Miss Dorothy Dix, we're looking at right now, visited a jail for women and was shocked to find that most of the prisoners there weren't really hardened criminals. They were actually mentally ill. And it was there that she found what guards considered to be lunatics locked in small cells with no heat. So people who weren't actually criminals being treated as criminals and being treated very unjustly. So following that visit, she went to other jails, to poorhouses and hospitals around Massachusetts and took reports of her findings. And these reports caused state legislators to fund a new mental hospital. And from there, she didn't stop with just Massachusetts. She continued to travel around the country and was able to convince legislators in other states to follow the lead of Massachusetts and to treat the mentally ill as patients who needed treatment, not as criminal lunatics. So the mentally ill were now being treated in hospitals instead of prisons. So this is a good thing. But there were still reforms that needed to be made on the prisons themselves. Men, women, children would all be placed in cramped cells together, and food was very, very scarce. And during this time, 5 out of every 6 people in northern jails were actually debtors who couldn't pay back money that they owed. So only 1 in 6 people in jails in the north were actually there for committing a crime. The other 5 were there because they couldn't pay back money that they owed, and they were thrown in jail because of these debts. But while they were in jail, they had no way of working, so they still had to pay back the debts, so many of them ended up right back in jail for years and years, and it was a very, very vicious cycle. And through the work of some very outspoken reformers, states passed legislation to improve the quality of prisons, provide shorter sentences for smaller crimes, and some even stopped treating debtors as criminals altogether. So, still making some progress here. Today in America, drug abuse is a very, very widespread problem. But in the 1800s, alcohol abuse was as widespread, and in some cases even more of a problem than drug abuse is in America today. Men, women, and even some children drank heavily, and whiskey could even be purchased in candy stores. So in the late 1820s, there was a movement that rose up called the temperance movement to battle the country's abuse of alcohol. And those involved in the movement promoted that alcohol led to wife beating, child abuse, and the breakup of families. Now, there were different levels within the temperance movement. So some groups urged people to simply drink less, while others pushed for people to stop drinking altogether. And the latter, the ones that push for everyone to stop drinking altogether, won a huge victory when the state of Maine banned all alcohol in 1851. And later on, when other states adopted similar, quote, Maine laws, which simply banned the use of alcohol within the borders of the state. Most of those laws would eventually be repealed, but the temperance movement didn't completely go away. Most of the leaders kept preaching for alcohol to be banned, but we really won't see that until next year when you're in U.S. history. And what we're looking at right here is a, quote, moral and physical thermometer, which was used by the temperance movement to tell the level of emotional and physical health associated with temperance versus intemperance. So the difference between drinking and non-drinking. And as we look into the level of alcohol associated with different things, the vices, diseases, and punishments that go along with it. And punishments: debt, black eyes, rags, hunder, almshouse, workhouse, jail, whipping, cattle, and the gallows. So the vices end in suicide, diseases end in death, and punishments end in the gallows. So yeah, that's pretty harsh. Well, so far today, we've looked at some of the movements pushing for reforms in hospitals, prisons, and against alcohol. And there were many other areas of society that needed to be reformed during this time, but the last one that we're going to look at during our study today is one of my favorites: the education system. In the early 1800s, very few children went to school. And those that weren't working in factories to help support their families were more than likely working in the fields on their family's farm. So in 1800, Massachusetts was the only state that required the community to provide free public school to all children. And these teachers were poorly trained and poorly paid, and students of all ages would sit in a crowded single room, kind of like the one we're looking at right now. To improve education, something had to be done if the country was going to move forward. And reformers argued that, quote, a republic required educated citizens. And one of those reformers is this man, Mr. Horace Mann. In 1814, New York State passed a law requiring local governments to set up school districts that were supported by local taxes. And Massachusetts also took the lead in trying to improve its existing school system under the direction of Horace Mann. And Mann was the head of the Massachusetts Board of Education. Now, what he did was he pushed the state to build new schools, lengthen the school year, and pay teachers a higher salary, and build colleges to train these teachers. And in doing so, the state built 3 new colleges just to train teachers. And by 1850, most of the northern states had similar school systems, but schools in the South improved much more slowly. However, in all states, schooling generally ended with 8th grade. That's right, schooling ended with 8th grade, and there were very, very few public high schools. So most of you that are watching this right now, once you finish this year, you would be done with school completely, and then you would start working in a factory or on a farm or some other job. Doesn't that sound like fun? And another thing to keep in mind is who these schools were for. Generally, they were for white students. African Americans had very little opportunity in the North and even less opportunity in the South to attend school. And while a few cities did set up separate schools for white and black students, the latter received very, very little funding. Attempts to educate African Americans, even free African Americans, often met with hostility and violence, but some students were able to go on to college, but those students were very few and very far between. And for students with disabilities, schools for the deaf and blind were begun during this time as well, but Even though it wasn't great, I want us to see that there was some improvement being made. But as you can see, as a country, we've still got a long, long way to go.
People who struggled to bring an end to slavery, such as the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and ex-slaves Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, were typical of the countless reformers that were active in America during the first half of the 19th century. These reformers, both men and women, worked hard not only to rid the nation of the evils of slavery, but also to improve education, improve the lives of the poor, improve conditions in the factories, improve the treatment of the mentally ill, improve the rights of women, and so forth. Some reformers even established ideal communities where people came to improve themselves by living and working together in peace and harmony. For they believed that if the conditions under which people lived were improved, ordinary human beings could accomplish truly amazing things. For example, a religious group known as the Shakers founded several ideal communities that at one time were home to as many as 6,000 people. Here, at Pleasant Hill in Kentucky, hundreds of Shakers shared housing and meals and practiced nonviolence, purity, and equality.
Which brings us to our favorite part of the day, the assignment. Now, there is no written assignment with today's lesson, but you will be responsible for this information on the upcoming quiz. So if you've not done so already, I advise you to go back and reread this section in the textbook and pay a special attention to the key terms and the different reform movements that were popping up at this time. Hospital reform, prison reform, the temperance movement, and attempts to improve on education. And like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.